tell the story of my journey in old-time Kentucky music. And I've always tried to tell the story as many different ways as I could and keep from telling a lie. And so it always keeps changing. It never comes out the same way twice. Kind of the way Paul Smith would play a fiddle tune. The people, the places, and the music follow me through life and continue to reveal much that I didn't know or understand at the time. All of us are on a musical journey of one kind or another. I think mine started as a little boy on my grandfather's farm near Baghdad, Kentucky. A radio set on the dining table and we listened to the Renfro Valley Barn Dance, the Grand Ole Opry, and whatever country music performers might be on WHS from Louisville, and the University of Kentucky basketball games on the radio. Claude Sullivan would say, and the cats will be moving from left to right on your radio dial. And you could look there and you could see that, you could see the game. In that little farm village, there was an old man who sat on the bench in front of Estes grocery store and picked his guitar. I was fascinated with him, and I would sit there and listen to him every time we would go to town. Then in my high school, there was a girl who played the guitar. She had long hair and dressed in black, so naturally I was smitten with her. And so I got a guitar. But the guitar was the only thing that lasted from that relationship. Later I got a mandolin and started learning bluegrass. Now something about bluegrass attracted me more than what most people were listening to at the time. I heard it on the radio and I started buying records. I also bought a fiddle, but I didn't do much with it until much later. I think I liked bluegrass because it sounded old, and it sounded like it was from the country, the kind of place that Baghdad was. During my college years, everybody was listening to the so-called folk singers, and they were pointing back to an older generation that we came to recognize as the old-time country musicians of the 1920s and 30s. After college, I found myself, much to my surprise and quite against my intention, at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. How that came about is another story for another time. But at this point, it was beginning to dawn on me that not much in my life was under my own control. More on that later. Among the many discoveries I made in England and Ireland, where a deep past was all around you, was the traditional music scene. Every village had its folk club, and Oxford and London had many. They met in the upstairs or back rooms of pubs, and they were flourishing at this time. I felt for the first time what it was like to be in the presence of ancient sounds, much older than bluegrass, which I thought was old. And I was touched by something that I could not really explain at the time. It was the beginning of an evolution backwards from bluegrass, and it seemed very mysterious and powerful. And so when I returned to the States, I was prepared without knowing it for the next chance encounter. It was fortuitous that my first personal encounter with an old-time traditional musician was with an African-American fiddler and singer named Bill Livers. There's a CD of Bill back there on the table that I put together. This connection was unforeseen and quite random. Bill was a tenant on a farm belonging to the family of the previous boyfriend of the girl I was dating. It's pretty random. She told me I needed to meet this Bill Ivers. The relationship with that girl didn't last either, but I made another connection that I had not seen coming, and it lasted until Bill died. Bill came from a black community around the small farming village of New Liberty in Owen County that was settled by blacks after the Civil War. Some of my friends and I formed a band with Bill, and we traveled and played together for 17 years. It was quite the adventure. It seemed to me that we were reenacting the story of Huckleberry Finn and Jim, the primal American story, with all its challenges to our assumptions about who we are and what we are here for. This was a continuing education that I needed and could not have attained in any other way, and for that also I'm most grateful. It redirected my life away from academia onto another path that I had not anticipated. The next step of this journey took me to Wolfe County, Kentucky for a year-long folk arts residency in the Wolfe County schools, where the superintendent was Richard Jett, who also happened to be the square dance caller at Natural Bridge State Park, a place that figures prominently in the history of Kentucky music, where people like Silas Rogers, Lily Mae Ledford, and Darley Fulks would come together to entertain the crowds who rolled down from Lexington and Cincinnati on the excursion trains. Richard Jett loved mountain music and encouraged young people in his school system to value it and stick with it. Among his many promotional activities, he hosted Wednesday evening performances by local musicians on the courthouse steps in Campton. He asked me if I would bring the Progress Red Hot String Band, the name we had given to our band with Bill Ivers, down to Campton to perform. Bill put on his usual great show, but this one time it was greeted with a rather chilly reception. There were no black people living in Wolfe County, and something about a black man having such a good time playing with a bunch of young white kids didn't seem to sit well with the audience. As all of us musicians know, you win some and you lose some. As we were packing up to leave, there occurred the next chance encounter that would alter the course of my life even more. An old man in shabby work clothes came up from the crowd as they were leaving, and without introducing himself, walked up to Bill, took him by the shoulders, and said to him, "I've always believed that our music came from your people." Now, this was in eastern Kentucky in 1976, before most of us were aware of the deep and profound connections between old-time music, including bluegrass, and the African-derived music that had been evolving on this continent for 400 years. This was my first encounter with Darley Fulks, who would be my mentor for the next 18 years. Darley was living in the 19th century, and before long I was too. I found myself spending most of my time with old people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and kids under 10. Every tune of Darley's had a story, a connection with some individual and a place. And for Darley, it was all alive in the present moment. I had not been looking for him, but it seemed that he had been waiting for me for a long time, just so he could pass all this along. I was beginning to realize that this adventure was not just about music, but also about place, belonging, being connected through time, and being connected to God, if you will, through the mysterious power that is music. As might have been expected from Darley's opening remark to Bill, his fiddle playing was very much in a black style. A second artist in the school's residency took me to neighboring Estill County the following year, where there was even more of a thriving community of old-time musicians who congregated in several downtown stores in Irvin and on the courthouse lawn on Saturdays. Asa Martin and his Cumberland Rangers had a live show on local radio station WIRV every Saturday morning, and I was privileged to play with them a few times. It was Asa who introduced me to the recordings of Doc Roberts, and he allowed me to borrow his original discs and copy them. Then I learned that Doc had also learned most of his music from black fiddlers. At the time that round-peak style was spreading through the growing community of young people discovering old-time music, I was listening to Doc Roberts and wondering, why aren't more people listening to this? I wondered the same thing about Darley, but then I decided, well, he might be just beyond comprehension. If you've heard Darley, you know what I mean. I tried to teach a class on Darley folks music one time at Cowan Creek. It was a big mistake. I was prepared and I did my best. It was over everybody's head, so sorry.
I loved it.
Were you there?
Yes.
It was different, wasn't it? The following year, I moved to Clay's Ferry on the Kentucky River. And see, all this is pretty random. And discovered another group of fiddlers, white, who, as fate would have it, had also learned mainly from black fiddlers. I had not started out to prove anything like this, but here it was again in the music that I was hearing in central Kentucky in the 1970s. I do not ascribe to the theory that everything about American history can be reduced to questions about race, but it was inescapable that here was a realm where racial mixing and accommodation had been happening on a personal level for a long time in small communities, no doubt to the benefit of both races. It's an interesting fact that the first two fiddlers in Kentucky history to be mentioned by name were also black fiddlers. Cato Watts at the Falls of the Ohio and Monk Estill at Boonesboro. Our recorded fiddle history begins with them and proceeds to where we are now. I believe there's hope and promise in recognizing these historical connections and these instances of mutual dependence among people living together in small communities, and these defy our generalizations. There were also women fiddlers, though not as many as there were women banjo players and singers. There seems generally to have been a superstition that the fiddle led to licentious behavior, which is no doubt true, and that was acceptable for men but not for women. The absurdity of this, of course, is illustrated by the fact that many women played the banjo with its own healthy predilection for sin. And so, in the end, allowance was made for all. The women fiddlers that I did encounter led me to the same caution that I had learned from seeing black communities up close and personal instead of from the standpoint of generalization. Rella Todd, Lily Mae Ledford, Emily Dickerson, Effie Pearson, and Nancy Stone Stevenson all played as good as any man, and in many cases better. But even more interesting was that rather than conforming to the stereotype of the poor, downtrodden mountain woman who was subservient to the man, in every case I observed, these women were treated with deference and respect, and seemed to rule over the music communities they were part of. All the fiddlers and banjo players in Clark and Estill County looked up to Lella Todd and acknowledged her as the master fiddler she was. Nancy Stevenson, the only daughter of the 11 children of Elsie Stone, all of whom played an instrument, was the only one who could play the almost impossible Humphrey's jig. All these women were special and stood out in their communities. In other words, if you had the gift of music, gender didn't matter. Here again, the music was above the considerations that otherwise divide us. In 1979, I finally got married. Bought a hill farm in Owen County, built a house, started a family, and began another vocation as an English teacher in the local high school. It was enlivening work in a rural county, and the summers gave me time to follow the music. During those busy years, I continued to meet more old fiddlers, banjo players, and singers. I met Gus Mead and later Mark Wilson, and together we began to issue recordings of the older musicians on the Rounder label. As more traditional music was being discovered across the country and brought to light through such new recordings, I became aware of a problem I think has only gotten worse with time, or for me at least. This may sound strange, but I'll say it anyway. There is too much music. There is too much information. In fact, there may be too much of everything for me. Whereas musicians in traditional music communities might have been exposed to fewer influences, that exposure was immediate and concentrated, and the knowledge of it could be traced back for generations. In addition, music had always filled a social, and I would say a spiritual need in communities that had to provide most necessities for themselves. This is one reason why the sounds of the old fiddlers from this time are so strikingly original, intense, and unique. They knew each other. They listened to each other, and they watched each other. Today, music is a commodity. Commercial pressures have given us such a vast cacophony of entertainments that it's impossible to even survey what's there, much less listen to it all. There are not enough hours in the day to intelligently listen to it, much less listen to it twice. And as soon as you stumble onto something you might like, it's replaced by something else from the same artist or a different artist in the same genre in a matter of weeks. Am I exaggerating if I call this a culturally induced attention deficit disorder? And if I say further that it is decadent. We have this blurring of boundaries, maybe not a bad thing. All sorts of hybrids and syntheses and descriptions that use the term tinged with. Always presented as something new and exciting, but I have to say it's all starting to sound alike to me. But again, I'm old. It happens to you. Bah, humbug. Bear with me. What, after all, I really want to know, is this thing called Americana? What does it really have to do with America? Does it mean anything? Or is it just a feeble attempt to assign a value to something that has no meaning, no basis in place of reality, and nothing to do with anything? I'm reminded, you know where this is going, Bill Monroe's comment about newgrass. That ain't no part of nothing. So, what part of something is this something that we all love and come to breaking up winter to share? I don't know that it can be defined, and maybe it's better if it's not. But certain things can be said about it. It came first from peasants and later from people who were living on the land and on the edge of the advancing industrial society. In other words, it came from the people who did the work. I've thought sometimes that maybe trial and hardship are a necessary component of the music we love, without which it becomes this superficial commodity that's here today and gone tomorrow. If that's true, then maybe we can expect a renaissance of great music from real people that will happen again in our lives, on the streets and in our homes, rather than in the giant blaring arenas and on our screens and devices. I once asked John Lozier, a great harmonica player and a real character, who played on the streets with Ed Haley, why there was so much great music during the Depression. And his answer was, there wasn't nothing else to do, so they just sat around and got good. We may not be far from such a time again, so we better be getting ourselves ready. And not just with our music, but with everything that the music was a part of. Local communities, friends, neighbors, local food, local consumption, and local responsibility for ourselves and our place on earth. The music reflected the landscape, and it embodied people's history. Listening to the fiddle sounds of East Kentucky, and then to the fiddle sounds of the Ohio River counties, you would find yourself in two different worlds. What makes that difference is what I want to understand. Those two environments look different, smell different, sound different, and have different economic and cultural histories. I've noticed that everywhere I've been. I know Kentucky better than any place else, and I've been all over Kentucky to the little towns and all the counties, and I've noticed people talk about Kentucky music. You know, you go to Cliff Top or somewhere and say, hey, let's play Kentucky music, but what is Kentucky? It is a state of mind, I grant you that. Tennessee's a state of mind. There's a whole lot of mythology that goes into that makes us feel like we belong to a place and who we are, and that's real and that's important. But you know, if you try to generalize from that and say, well, Kentucky's this way, Tennessee's that way, and Alabama's that way, it gets you nowhere. In fact, what I've learned is every little town is different. Every little county is different. It's got a different vibe, a different feel. People kind of relate to you in different ways. And it doesn't follow a north, south, east, west kind of expected divide. You just got to take every place and every county on its own terms. So, to totally understand what makes traditional music what it is, we need to understand its connections and somehow bring them into our own lives. It's not enough to just learn some cool new tune that your friends haven't heard before, a tune that's just one more among many thousands. Most of us are good enough to play any tune well and make it our own if we happen to like it, but a tune is much more than that. What we are really looking for is the deeper connection with the people who played it, going back as far as we can trace it, with the community and place it came from, and with the history of that community. Only then, I think, can we get to the heart of it and what it might mean. So how do we do this when the sources of what we were looking for are buried in the past in a time before most of us were born? Or put another way, how do we understand anything without a knowledge of its history? First, I would say, if possible, go to the place and look around. Meet some people. Talk to them. Make some connections, casual or otherwise, and get a feel for the local vibe. Read some history, especially local and regional history, which gets us closer to the real people whose history matters just as much, if not more, than the great man kind of history we studied in school. And if you are of a more mystical inclination, learn about the geology that underlies the landscape and the natural history of the plants and animals that live there. And you will begin to hear that in the music. We can also listen to the many interviews that are available of source musicians and get to know them in their own words. I used to assign my students to read the transcript of the Buddy Thomas interview that filled the inside panel of his Rounder LP. His words and his language meet all the criteria of good communication. If you go further and listen to the interviews that the album notes were excerpted from, then you really get to know the person and feel the soul of the great artist and genius that he was. And the artist and the genius he was born with rickets, never grew to a full-size person. He was very short. He had a cleft skull where the bones in the skull never closed together. From malnutrition, he had very short, stubby fingers. And he died way too young. And yet, if you listen to his music, he was a great artist and a great genius. You can say the same thing for Luther Strong, who was an itinerant alcoholic, thrown in jail every weekend. The sheriff kept a fiddle in the jail so he could play for the sheriff. And by chance, Alan Lomax happened to hazard on a weekend when Luther Strong was in jail there with Bev Baker, another fiddler. And he heard about him, and they got him out of jail and took him across the street to the Hazard Hotel and recorded Luther Strong. And this man who lived an impossibly hard life in a family, the Strongs, that was known for its violence. You listen to his playing, and it's the top level of any traditional fiddle playing that it could ever be. I mean, he is truly a master. How? How do you explain people coming up through such hardship that could produce such wonderful, unimaginable art? We need to take advantage of every scrap of information we can find about the people whose music we are interested in. If we do that, they can live through us as we point back to them. It can also be helpful to read some of the many academic studies that are available about the old music traditions. And so I go back in time a lot to these places and these people, and I even talk to the people who are no longer with us, and they talk to me. And I think a lot of us experience those things as we get older with our family members and our loved ones, and certainly with the old music people we knew. So these are the things the old people knew, and we should know it too, if we are to understand them. So what this means is, for music, I think we should look first in our own backyards. That's what Mark and Richard have done, and that's what Trish and Howard have done. That's where they start. Music was everywhere, and you can be sure that it included fiddle music. Mary Alice was just talking about the music she heard up in New York, and it was everywhere. And I want to hear that myself, not necessarily so I can learn to play it, but just to hear the differences as you go from place to place, and just have the opportunity to wonder about that. So music was everywhere, and you can be sure that it included fiddle music, and it showed the same connections with place and history that I've described in Kentucky. Great as they might have been, do we all need to play just like Tommy Gerald or Benton Flippin if we don't live in the North Carolina Piedmont? No style is better than any other style, but a tradition that is your own is probably better than one that is not. Having a home and living in a place we are connected to may be the highest civilized value that we can attain. Blakely and Olivia, what am I always saying to you? You'll get there. Something we're desperately going to need if we're going to survive the final destructive phase of capitalist materialism. As I said, I learned more than just music from the old people I spent my time with. And so in closing, I would like to share some gems of wisdom from some of my mentors. Playing the fiddle is like trying to get to heaven. You kind of have to feel your way along. Bill Ivers. That's certainly what I've done. I've learned there are no formulas, and lessons can only indicate some general practices that you have to interpret and make your own. I also take Bill's notes as pointing to sliding notes, where indeed you do feel your way along until you get the pitch you want. I concluded after playing with and watching Paul Smith for many years that he slid every note he ever played, however slightly. He felt his way along, and he most certainly got to heaven. Along with Melvin Wine, and some of you remember Paul Smith from the time he was at Breaking Up Winter. Along with Melvin Wine, he was as saintly an individual as I ever met. 2, no fool, no fun. That was also Bill Ivers. This is one of his sayings, and it was also his practice. It reminds us not to take ourselves too seriously. We play music. It's supposed to be fun, and it keeps us young. The greatest players have no ego. Paul Smith and Jesse Wells have been my guiding lights in this ongoing struggle. I recommend a book to you that Anna Roberts-Revolt just sent this to me out of the blue. It's called To Be Nothing by Benedicte Marceth. It's a student's interviews with her master, Knut Hamre, who is a Norwegian Hardanger fiddle master. Now you might think, what does it have to do with us? Well, everything. The title says